Hello and welcome to my review of KTM's new 890 SMT. Let me just say that I freely acknowledge that I do have a tendency to go off on a tangent or two during some of my reports. So this week I'm not going to waste any time at all. I'm going to start on a major tangent. Acronyms, very useful things. A collection of letters that permits easy, quick communication, especially if you know exactly what the letters stand for. USA, for instance, I'm sure you all immediately knew which country I was talking about. LOL, VIP, KFC, OMG, WTF. You get the picture, and very quickly. DNA? Yeah, I can't think what those three letters stand for exactly either, but I know it's a unique biological fingerprint of sorts found in everything from hairs to saliva, and if you want to commit the perfect crime, then, well, you'd best not leave any trace of it behind. LSD? A hippie psychedelic drug associated with some weird visual effects, apparently. But I've no idea what it stands for exactly. KTM? Like me, I'm sure you're all imagining any number of orange Austrian bikes, off-road perhaps, or adventure, or street bikes like the beastly Super Duke R. Or maybe it's racing. They do refer to themselves as the ready-to-race brand after all, and they've dominated every type of competition they've basically ever entered, from MX and Dakar right through to Moto3, Moto2, and now of course MotoGP. Unless you're a serious member of the Orange Army though, you probably can't tell me what KTM stands for. But it really doesn't matter, does it? Because you still know what I'm referring to. And interestingly, I can pretty much guarantee that you also imagined not just the hardware, the bikes, but also something that much more indefinable, an attitude. A bit like a product such as Red Bull is always associated with extreme sports, KTM always seems to be linked with hardcore riding exploits. Okay, last acronym for now anyway. How about SMT? Well, not only is it an acronym, it's also something of an oxymoron. Can a bike built on the premise of an oxymoron actually work in the real world? KTM seems to think so. And given its track record of making class-leading new models at the first attempt, the least I can do is get some riding done in the name of finding out. KTM got so carried away with their own ready-to-race marketing that they actually got the local carabinieri to close off a section of road so they could set up an official hill climb event where, contrary to what we were told at the time, they actually had the stopwatch out and going for everyone. Since I was only wearing riding jeans and a lightly armoured jacket and I'm not familiar with the implications of copious amounts of cow poo on the racing line, I decided to take it easy. Otherwise, you know, I might have sneaked in ahead of one of the two French or Polish journalists who eventually locked out the podium positions. Or, indeed, not. I've never been on a road-based KTM World launch before, so I've no idea if this was exceptional or ordinary, but I have to say it was very refreshing to have the groups of 7 or 8 journalists led at such a invigorating pace. Speed limits? There were undoubtedly some, somewhere, but we happily ignored them all and rode, well, like we all ride normally, not being an irresponsible idiot through the villages, but otherwise treating every speed limit like it was in mile an hour rather than kilometres an hour. The back roads around here are, it turns out, very similar to what confronted us in Sardinia, although, this being France, the condition of the tar is generally of a much higher quality than you tend to find in Italy. Take this stretch of road that I
stumbled across, for example. It's only a little over 20 kilometres in length. It runs along the side of the Gorge de la Nesque, nestled on the foothills of Mont Ventoux. And for its entire length, and I do mean its entire length, there's not one single bump, no undulation of any kind, and the tar is very grippy, incredibly smooth, and perhaps more important than anything, it's entirely consistent as well.
It's very tight and twisty, quite narrow in places, and should you make a mistake, the only thing preventing you from becoming a bit of a pink smudge on the rocks of the valley floor hundreds of meters below are some very low stone walls or wooden guardrails, and strangely the occasional bit of manicured hedge for some reason. Other than that, this tremendous stretch of road is close to being a biker's paradise. Well, at least for a biker who has a sport bike with an upright riding position and a torquey engine, some capable brakes and a suite of advanced electronic ride arrays to finesse the demands on front and rear grip, should the need arise.
Fortunately for me, that's exactly what I'm riding, because this road on something like a race replica superbike would be nothing other than, well, I would imagine incredibly frustrating. As it is, on something like the SMT, it's utterly brilliant. About as much fun as you can have on public roads, in fact.
Right, let's have a closer look at this thing then, starting with the obvious point, and that's the looks. It's a supermoto, and since these are bikes that owe their existence to dirt bikes that have been modified to work on tar, you can pretty much guarantee that it's going to look, well, awkward at best. On top of that, this is a KTM, and let's be honest here, the Austrian manufacturer is not renowned for making pretty bikes, is it? Distinctive, imposing, memorable for sure, but beautiful? Nah. Since a supermoto bike is a hybrid of on and off-road traits, it's no great surprise that the SMT looks the way it does. A quick once-over suggests that this is the 890 Adventure, made road-ready with some wider 17-inch road rims, and although that broad description might hold an element of truth, there's more going on here than initially meets the eye. The most striking feature, the bit that almost literally pokes you in the eye, is this high mudguard. It's something of a Marmite characteristic. You're either going to love it or hate it. The response to the early reveal images on social media suggested that the overwhelming response was negative. I surprised myself though by deciding that I preferred it to the rather anonymous but more traditional looking low carbon fibre alternative. At least it has the benefit of being distinctive, in your face and full of attitude, much like the brand itself. I think half the problem is that in those early pictures the mudguard looked disproportionately large, more awkward than it actually is in the flesh. Okay, with that out of the way, let's take a look around the rest of the bike. The fuel tank has been redesigned from the one on the Adventure models, and that features a kind of front saddlebag split fuel tank design, giving a maximum of 20 litres capacity. The SMT doesn't take this option, so fuel capacity is limited to 15.8 litres, although that should still be good for knocking on 300 kilometres. Even on our mad and very rapid launch ride, I think I might have seen that distance out of my fuel had we kept going. And that's pretty impressive given the hard nature of the riding. The adventure bike heritage continues with the single piece seat, designed like this to give you lots of room to move around while you're in full sport riding mode. But given that the SMT's mission brief is to shake up the sport touring segment, it also needs to be comfortable for a good couple of hours at a time. I'll be uploading a follow-up SMT video in another week or so, where I'll be concentrating more on its touring abilities. But in the meantime, let me just say that after nearly 1,000 kilometers of riding now, this is, I am sure, the most comfortable standard seat I've ever come across on a KTM road or adventure bike. And it's not just comfortable for a KTM, it's one of the best I've sampled on any middleweight touring bike. And that's not something I expected to be saying of the SMT a week or so ago. In terms of chassis, it's as you would expect. So you've got a tubular chrome moly frame with the engine also acting as a stressed member, effectively becoming part of the chassis. The compactness of this design means KTM could fit a longer swing arm that has benefits for traction. The subframe is also a lightweight steel trellis affair, but obviously it's super strong given that it needs to be able to transport some potentially big loads that might include rider, passenger and luggage for two. The suspension, given the Supermoto DNA, is longer travel than you would normally find on a sport tourer, but the WP Apex fork and rear shock have got easy to use adjusters, and that's a big plus, especially for the preload on the rear shock, so you can adjust for passenger and luggage in a matter of seconds.
Right, this 889cc parallel twin is essentially mechanically the same as the other 890s in the range, although the numbers with this at 105 horsepower and 100 Newton meters put it in exactly the same state of tune as the Adventure. Now, if like me, when you heard about the SMT, you were hoping for a version out of the engine with the Duke, so in other words, at least 115 horsepower, then looking at the spec sheet, you might be a little bit disappointed, but there's no need to be. Ridden on the road, on a particularly wriggly road like this, where torque and instant response to the throttle are the most important elements of how an engine performs, I would not argue with KTM when they say that up to 8,000 RPM this engine performs much better than the Duke. And yeah, it feels like it. It feels gutsy from low down. And that's exactly, on a road like this, which is essentially hairpin after a hairpin, that's exactly what you want. So I've no doubt actually that this SMT feels faster than at least the standard Duke.
If you ride it on a road full of fast third and fourth gear sweepers, you might at first be a little underwhelmed by the engine's apparent disinterest in living up near the red line for any extended period of time.
It's not unwilling exactly, it's just that the far reaches of the rev range are not this motor's sweetest point. The way I've clattered into the rev limiter on more than a few occasions tells me that the mid-range is genuinely very, how can I put it, athletic, because it just propels you right through the mid-range and into the red line before you've got a chance to hook another gear. I mean, when I've been trying to hang on to the revs between faster third and fourth gear corners, that's when I've thought, you know what, yes, it's a lovely engine, but I'd really like another 500, maybe even 1,000 RPM to play with. Where this engine really does shine though is at the bottom end, and I do mean right at the bottom end. Anything just above tick over really. And that's where its ability to give you that immediate shove out of tiny little hairpins like these is so rewarding. The fueling is it's just perfect at all times. There's never a hiccup. There's never a too harsh a response to the throttle. I mean, admittedly, I am riding it in the street mode setting for the throttle at the moment, just because it helps you be smooth. It can feel, you can make it feel that little bit more sporty by adjusting the throttle response, but I've left well alone, to be honest. Yes, it's a little bit more entertaining, but by the same token, when you're trying to flow through a series of turns, it's just that little bit more difficult to roll on and off the throttle perfectly smoothly. You're not sacrificing any power by going for the softer throttle setting. You're just, well, basically making your life a little bit easier if you're into smoothly negotiating a series of turns.
Lots of go means, for peace of mind, you also need lots of stopping, and if you're a slave to the spec sheet, then you might be feeling a little let down because there's no top of the line Brembo calipers or master cylinder here. What you get is KTM badged JJ radial calipers and 320mm discs at the front end with a 260mm jobby at the rear. Again, these are what you'd find on the Adventure models, but for some reason, a change of pad material, I think, they work like a much more road-oriented sport bike's brakes than you'd think. Plenty of initial bite, decent power, and enough feel in there that you can happily scrub speed deep into an apex.
They might, I suppose, lack the outright levels of one-finger performance that you get with the best that Brembo's got to offer, but they're still very, very good. More than up to the job of bringing the SMT down to some manageable speeds. The rear brake as well. I mean, normally when I review a bike, I barely, if at all, mention it, but since this bike has an S and an M in its name before the T, I suppose we should afford it more than a passing glance.
I say in theory because the SMT's behaviour while being sideways, rear wheel leaving a big darkie as it carves a graceful arc into a hairpin, is definitely a thing. I saw it happen frequently enough on the launch ride, but I'm going to have to hold my hands up and say that in the interests of self-preservation, I decided not to practice this dark art for the first time on public roads, while most of my brain was already occupied with maintaining the rapid pace.
In the meantime though, I'm more than happy to indulge my need for speed and a bit of adrenaline with a more traditional riding style, whether that be sat squarely in the middle of the seat or with me moving around a little bit from side to side, from peg to peg on the bike. That's one of the strengths of the SMT. Its riding position really does work well for whichever type of riding style you want to employ, depending on your mood and how aggressive you want to be and what type of road that you're traveling along. Tight and twisty like this, yes, a supermoto foot out style will probably be ideal, but at my age it just seems to give me cramp in my hip flexors. Oh, I do sound a bit old doing that. And when it gets a bit faster though, I mean, it's equally happy for you to hang off and stick your knee out and drag a knee slider if that's what you want to do. It's just that when the corners on a tight road like this come so quickly one after the other, it actually feels a bit slower.
As usual, because I'm a waffling waster of a bike journalist, I'm banging on for far too long, and I haven't even mentioned any of the good stuff that's relevant to this model's touring pretension, so I'm going to try and put a cork in it for now and bring this initial review to a close. There's so much more that I want to tell you about, not least of which is the suspension, arguably the SMT's best point, and of course the comprehensive suite of electronics the TFT dash, the turn-by-turn navigation, the pillion comfort, the rider wind protection, the KTM luggage system, the Remus exhaust that this particular bike is sporting. But that will all have to wait until sometime next week, assuming the weather holds off for long enough. It's forecast for rain over much of France for the next week to 10 days. So check back in again, please, next week to see if I found a gap to film part 2 of this review.